The reason why we exist is that over the years, the World Bank gave South Africa quite a high rating um, to deal with our credit bureaus and the effectiveness of our credit bureau information and the sharing of information. But despite that high score from the World Bank, there was still a drive in South Africa years ago to close down the credit bureaus. And just a few of the reasons for that. First of all, consumers didn't know how the credit bureaus operate, and they did not see any positive in credit bureaus. And I think I must just add that that was 10 years ago the case, and it's probably still the case. Consumers just do not see any positive in credit bureaus. It takes a lot of consumer education to make them see any positive. They were also only confronted with credit bureaus when they were declined for credit. So that was the first time that they heard anything about a credit bureau and credit bureau information. And on the other hand, the credit bureaus didn't see the consumers as a stakeholder. They only saw business and business opportunities. The consumers also felt that if they wanted to dispute information, there was no credible organization to go to. And if we go back into our history in South Africa, a few years ago, before the National Credit Act, the credit bureaus were not regulated at all. These were private institutions gathering information, selling it according to their business models, but there was no act, no regulations in place to tell them what to do and what they can and what they can't do. And there was no rights for consumers, almost, when they wanted to dispute anything. That, of course, all changed with the National Credit Act and 2006 when the new act came into force. So today we sit with the following situation where consumers do have rights. They've got a right to a free credit report. Once a year, it has to be free. But even if they want to obtain 2 or 3 reports throughout the year, they can. There's nothing stopping them to get more reports, but they have to pay for the others. But it's a minimal amount. They can also challenge the accuracy of the information. That's a right given to them in terms of the Act. And they've got the right to an effective process now, giving the credit bureaus only 20 days to respond matters like that. But on the other hand, the consumer perception about the credit bureaus, I was asked to just touch on that. Prior to 2004, and that is the date there is important because that's the date then that this office, the Credit Ombud's office, was established. That consumers only saw that they were being blacklisted. That is the only thing they knew about credit bureaus. There was a complete lack of confidence in the dispute process, and there was a threat. There was a threat about marching and closing down the credit bureaus. They felt it was a violation of their human rights. Government perception prior to 2004, even our government considered closing down the credit bureaus because they also saw it as a contributing factor to the deteriorating economy because they thought that the information was not correct, it was incomplete. And of course, I think one must remember that their perception, if you talk about government and government employees, would have been based on what they were told by consumers in their constituencies. That there was a lack of accountability of the credit bureaus and their subscribers, that there was no regulating authority for these organizations, and that they heard too many stories about mismatch of information, for example, incorrect ID numbers, incorrect names and surnames. And in South Africa, I don't know about other countries, but there are a lot of consumers with the same names and surnames. And then the only difference will be, of course, the ID numbers. So even our government had a negative perception at the time of our credit bureau organizations. So the background to the creation of this office, it started, as we said, in March 2004, and it was only focused on credit information. Again, it was as a result of this whole debacle and the talks about closing down credit bureaus. And one of the efforts to try and calm the market, to try and show good faith, was to say, well, we'll set up an Ombud scheme for consumers to where they can go and complain. And we will listen to the Ombud scheme if there's anything wrong. So that is how this office was created. And at the time, we were called the Credit Information Ombud. I think some of you may still see that name floating around. So for a few years, we operated only as an Ombud scheme dealing exclusively with complaints about credit bureau information. But in about 2009, there was a Finmark report that is, and they saw that there was a huge gap in the market for a non-bank credit ADR. There were the bank clients had an ADR. Everybody else had an ADR. There were ADRs for the insurance people, for many other markets. But if you were in the non-bank credit market, there was nowhere to go. And the council of this organization at the time decided that they can actually extend their jurisdiction. They can start accepting those complaints. I mean, there was an operating office with enough employees. So they changed the name to the Credit Ombud, no longer the Credit Information Ombud. And in 2010, this office started accepting complaints in terms of non-bank credit. So now we had two departments really effectively. The one department taking complaints in respect of credit bureaus and credit bureau information, and the other department taking complaints in respect of the non-bank credit transactions. And just to explain what that is in our world, it is all the micro-lending, it is the clothing accounts, it is the furniture accounts, and we also have a couple of organizations granting home loans, and that's not a bank, and even motor vehicle finance. That's done by organizations that are not banks. So that is really the market that we deal with. We're a voluntary body, and the advantage of a voluntary body is that we have more flexibility than a statutory body, because in South Africa, and I'm sure everywhere around the world, it is not that easy or quick to change legislation. So as a voluntary body, we only have our own documents, that created us, and I will share that with you now. So it's very easy. We just go to our council. We need to change something. There's a change in the market. We literally go and retype our founding documents. No legislative changes are necessary. We also registered with the South African Revenue Services as a public benefit organization. And just the importance of this is that the contributions that our members pay towards our fees, to keep this office afloat, those contributions are then tax deductible for the organization, which is of course a big benefit to them, because we are a public benefit organization, and then it almost is not coming out of their pocket, the fees that they have to pay. Corporate governance for an institution like ours is very important, and you have to get this right, because otherwise people will attack you to say that this ADR, this organization does not have proper corporate governance, they're not independent, they're not fair, all sorts of attacks like that, and they're not complying with the latest leading principles. So in our organization, we have really two documents. It's not very complicated or lengthy documents, and if anybody ever wants to ask us to share this, I can do that easily. We have a constitution of the association, and this is the association of all the members, all the credit organizations and the credit bureaus who belong to our association. So that's the constitution, and then there's a terms of reference, which is really what sets out what type of complaints we can take and how we must deal with it, and are more process related. So those are the only two documents, and that's all that's required in our law if you are an association. But that is, of course, it's a legal entity separate from its members. That is just the vehicle that we used. You can also use other vehicles like a company or a Section 21 company in our law. That is a non-profit company, but we use the association. We report to a council. Now the council is very important because that is the basis on which we can say that we're an independent organization, because we report to this council. And the reason why we can say that is because the council is made up of various bodies, which I will show you just now. I'll go back to this. Sorry. I just wanted to see if the council are, the list of the council members are in one of the further slides. The council members are made up of various constituencies, and we have to ensure that the independent and the consumer bodies are always one more at least than the credit bodies. And that then ensures that we do not report to the credit constituency, and that the credit constituency, the people that we can rule against, are not the ones who tell us what to do. So we have consumer bodies on our council, we have independent members, quite a few journalists, for example, on our council, and then we have the credit constituency, various organizations representing the credit industry and the credit bureau industry on the council. The council operates similar, we call them a council, but in a company world you will call them a board. So they are council committees, and they operate on exactly the same principles as any board committee would. We have formed at least 4 meetings a year, formal meetings of the council, and then of course we have more regular meetings of the council subcommittees, and we as the Ombud's office have to report to the subcommittees who report to the council. We of course also prepare annual reports and regular statements which we present to the council members. Another important point, I think, if anybody is interested ever in setting up an Ombud scheme or evaluating a current Ombud scheme, is that the World Bank prepared a report about 2 years ago by some leading ombudsmen in Europe, and they drew up the report, and it is called the Fundamental Principles for Financial Ombud Schemes. It is a very, very comprehensive, lengthy document, and it sets out in detail what the European ombudsman think should be the fundamental principles for a financial ombud scheme. We had a look at that document, and we adopted as many of those principles as was applicable to our office. So we also now have a document which we call the Principles of the Office of the Credit Ombud, and we strongly base it on the World Bank report. And this is just an example. We for example, said that, and this is the only one there where I give some details. We subscribe to the principle of independence. Now you may ask, what do we mean by that? And then we go in the document and we explain that to be independent, you have to have the right staff. They have to have skills. You have to be independent from the people that we can investigate. In other words, we have to be independent from the credit providers and the credit bureaus that we investigate. And yes, they are represented on our council, but they're not the people that can tell us what to do. We have to be able to be critical of our members. The appointment of the Ombud is very important, and he has to be independent from the industry. The salary of the Ombud and even the funding of the entire office should not be influenced by the industry. In other words, you can't say that the salary or the bonus of the Ombud is dependent on what type of findings he makes. If he finds against the industry, then they will not increase his salary next year. So those are all little principles, but it's important in order to maintain your independence. And even the ombudsman must also enjoy tenure, and that means that he cannot just be fired by the industry if they don't like his findings, if they don't like what he says, but it has to be real incompetence. That is just the only one that I explained, but these are the other principles which we adopted, and as I said, based on the World Bank report, and each one goes into some detail of what we then mean by, if we say we adopt the principle of fairness, what do we mean by fair? We have to listen, for example, to both parties. We have to have both parties must have an opportunity to put forward their case. We can't just, the odi alteram partem rule in law is both parties must put forward their cases. Just another one, for example, consent. We cannot investigate a case if we don't have proper consent from the consumer, that we can access his credit bureau report, that we can disclose his complaint to the credit provider. We have to have proper consent in writing or at least telephonically recorded. Accountability, I think some of these speak for themselves. But again, it's a document that we can share if anybody is interested. Just almost as a side point, the principles of funding is very important for an Ombud scheme. Because as you can imagine, that we are funded by the members of the association. So the members, of course, are the credit industry, the credit non-bank credit providers, and the credit bureaus, and the subscribers to the bureau. So these are the people that must fund this office. And that's, you know, when you establish the office 2004, apparently it was not that difficult because there was a real reason why they wanted the office established. But, you know, as the years go on, there's not always institutional memory, and you have new people in place, and you'll send out the invoice and a new CFO will ask you, who's the credit ombud and why should I pay this? So it's an ongoing education issue for us. But also we implemented a new model. Previously our contributions were based mostly on records, credit bureau records. That was a historical basis of calculation, and now we're going to base it on the records as well as the number of complaints. So each year you will look at the number of complaints an organization had the previous year, as well as records at the credit bureaus, and you know, based on different percentages, you will work out the contribution of this organization towards our office's budget. I just added here that the records at the credit bureaus, you may think, why is this relevant? And it is relevant because it indicates the number of credit agreements entered into by that entity, and it also indicates the number of potential complainants. Because of, you know, when we do a budget, we budget for the next year. We cannot predict exactly how many complaints we will be receiving. So it's a bit of the historical number, which is complaints, and a bit of a prediction number, which is number of current clients and records at the credit bureaus. It's important that the criteria that you use has to be objective and verifiable. People talk about all sorts of other criteria, you know, turnover and assets, and there are a lot of possibilities, but we at this office, we need to be able to verify that information in order to calculate an invoice. So these two criteria, the complaints and credit bureau records, it's very easy to verify. When it comes to complaints handling, I think people ask me to just quickly deal with that. How do we deal with complaints? Well, I think the obvious thing is that our operations has to be as consumer friendly as possible, and we have to make this process unintimidating and easy. In South Africa, we do have a lot of consumers who really, they are literate in the sense that they entered into a credit agreement because that's how they got onto the credit bureau. That is why they have a credit complaint. But they really cannot understand what they signed for. And a lot of them are not unemployed, so they don't have email addresses. They don't all have access to the internet. So mostly we accept telephonic complaints. We do not say that they have to write it out. It does not have to be a formal written complaint. A telephonic complaint which we record is good enough. We have trained call center agents that can probe and that can then write down the consumer's complaint for them. But we also, obviously, we accept fax complaints, email complaints, or even if we receive it by post. All the languages are entertained. We have people in the office who can speak all the languages, although it is very seldom requested. Most people accept that they will have to speak English when they contact the office, but we do offer. And every now and then there is a consumer who say, well, I would rather prefer to speak in my home language. And then we will find an employee who can assist them. All the calls are recorded. We will accept walk-ins, people who just arrive at our office without appointments, because again, they sometimes have to take public transport. They arrive here with paperwork and they sort of have a dire problem, so we will not show them away because they didn't make an appointment. We only have one office in the country, but in our view, because of the telephonic nature that we take down complaints, we are still accessible to consumers, as well as the internet, email, and faxes. A little bit more about complaints handling, and this was just a comment and a slide that I did for somebody else who wanted to start up an Ombud scheme, is that it's important to create a brand and a logo, because going forward, this is what you're going to use to create awareness. Right from the start, you have to employ well-skilled staff. In our office, we have about 7 lawyers, and we also have, and the other staff, we have quite a few who worked at credit bureaus before, so they understand credit bureau reports very well. Because as you all know, consumers out there, the general public, do not understand a credit bureau report. So the lawyers work with the legal issues, and we have other staff that can assist them with the credit bureau issues. You have to design a process that, and we just said to the consultant here that you have to keep it manual until you understand exactly what your issues are going to be before you do sort of a computer-generated thing. We have a case management system, so we have a paperless system, no papers. Everything is scanned, or it's on email already attached onto a case, and the case managers work on the emails and on the system. All the notes are kept on the system, all the documents are kept on the system, so as long as you have a consumer's surname or ID and you call up that case, everything appears in front of you, as well as any note that you make, that phone the consumer, he told me XYZ, you'll type the note and it will sit on the case. If you send emails, if you send letters, if you receive documents, it's all on the case until you finally resolve the case. If you recall that I said that there were 2 documents, there was the Constitution, and then there's the terms of reference and our jurisdiction. Now the terms of reference, that's the other document that spells out what we can do, what we can't do as an Ombud scheme. And often when there are difficult attorneys on the other side, they go to this document to try and pinpoint what we can and cannot do and what our rights are, because it's spelled out in the terms of reference. But the obvious statements are there, that we have to act objectively and independently, that we will have regard to fairness, justice, and equity. Now, just to add there, and that is slightly different from our regulator. Obviously, the regulator can also look at consumer complaints. Obviously, the regulator has the right to take a consumer complaint and deal with it. But they are bound to apply the law, to apply the National Credit Act. Whereas in our office, we can apply fairness. And that's a huge difference, because we do look at the law. It's not like we disregard the law. We will look at codes of conduct, we will look at guidelines. But in the final analysis, we can also look at what is fair, and we can make a decision based on fairness as well, especially if you're dealing with a disadvantaged consumer. But I can also maybe add that very often it's not even necessary, because if there are breaches of the Act and breaches of the law, then we don't even have to go to the fairness, because it's clear-cut what was wrong with the case. We are only accountable to the council. We state that in our terms of reference. And it is also a function of the Credit Ombud to educate consumers. You have to put that in, because if you do not put that in, you will be challenged that what gives you the right to stand on a podium and tell consumers about your office, about credit matters. We've had those challenges. And of course, if you don't educate the consumers about the existence of the office and about what type of matters they can bring to us, then you won't have any complaints to deal with. The second point is also very important, and that is the members are bound by our decisions. They agree to that when they join up to be a member of the association. They agree that they will be bound by the Constitution and the Terms of Reference. In the Terms of Reference, we state that the members are always bound by our decisions, but the consumers are not bound. So a consumer, even though they brought the case to us, even though we do the case for them free of charge, if they do not like our decision, they can walk away and they can go to a lawyer, they can go to the regulator, they can go wherever. They are not bound by our decisions. Only the members are, because of course the members signed up to be bound by our decisions. 99% of our cases, we do not have to make decisions. A decision in this case means a ruling, where we make a formal decision in writing, where we order somebody to do something specific or to resolve a case in a specific manner. We never get to that point, hardly ever. We haven't made a ruling in about 3 years. All the other cases are resolved through negotiations with the credit providers on the one hand, the consumer on the other hand, until we meet in the middle and we resolve the matter to the satisfaction of both these parties. So that's not a decision of the credit ombud. That is maybe the credit ombud staff pointing out what is wrong, where there was a transgression, where there was an overcharge by the credit provider. They will offer to write off something, they will offer to recalculate. Then on the other hand, you have a consumer who says, okay, now I'm happy with the new figure. So that is the way we resolve matters, through negotiation and conciliation. We've had a few mediations where we have to actually call parties to our offices to sit around the table, where the sort of negotiation in writing via email didn't resolve the matter. But then at the mediation table, it was resolved. So again, we didn't have to make any ruling against somebody. Credit information, just very specifically on credit bureau information. We have a jurisdiction which we've spelled out in the terms of reference, where we say that we have jurisdiction over the following, and we can look at cases relating to, complaints about, and then there's this list. So the list says inaccurate or incorrect default information, if the information is not complete, if it's outdated, if the proper process wasn't followed, because in our law, the credit grantor or the service supplier have to give the consumer notice that he's going to be listed negatively on the bureau before he can do so. Now, sometimes that process is not followed, and the consumer can prove to us that he never received any notice. And then, of course, they will say that if they had received the notice, they would have fixed the problem or cured the default. So we can look at those complaints. So this is just what gives us the right to look at these complaints and investigate them. Cases where a consumer defaulted through no fault of his own, this is, for example, retrenchment, and they subsequently rehabilitate themselves. We have a jurisdiction specifically written into our terms of reference for this. Listings in respect of prescribed debt. In our law, a debt prescribes after 3 years. The law says you must not list something that has already prescribed. Of course, it happens very often. Consumers complain about it. Our terms of reference say we can take complaints relating to that. Duplicate listings, identity fraud listings, and service disputes. This is, for example, where a consumer says, well, they listed me negatively, but the reason why I didn't pay is because I never received the service. I cannot pay them if they never delivered the goods. They didn't fix what they were supposed to fix, and how can they now list me for this? So we have to go into that whole history of a case sometimes. Then, just on a different topic, this is our PR and communication. And as I said earlier, this is very important, Because without PR, nobody will know that our office exists, and we will not have a single consumer complaining to us. And then the whole, existence of our office, the creation of an Ombud scheme by the industry for their consumers, was pointless. They're not going to do the PR and communication for us. But it's in our mandate that we can do the PR, and that we have to educate consumers about our office. So there are a couple of things. You have to start raising awareness. And from day one, you have to be in the news. There is no other way that you can get, and I mean, even after 10 years, I cannot explain to you how many people do not know about our office or what we do. But I think more, they just don't know that we exist. So you have to get into the news, you have to write to magazines, to newspapers, you have to talk to people, you have to be on podiums, telling people that there is an office such as the Credit Ombud, where we try and assist consumers with issues relating to the credit complaints, as well as credit bureau information complaints. I've already said this, I mean, people must remember who we are and how to get hold of us. And ideally, they must then spread the word to their community, to their friends. If they talk to somebody and the person says, oh, I've got this problem about being blacklisted, then they must immediately say, oh, I've heard about an organization that can assist you. That is where we would like to get. The awareness activities, we have our website. If you can all log onto our website, you'll see our previous press releases there. The annual reports are on our website. We have the little pamphlets that we hand out at shopping centers, at workshops with communities. The media is a very important aspect of our world, because without media awareness, we will not have consumers phoning us. We've seen that there's a direct correlation between us getting into the media and the phones ringing. If myself or maybe the Ombudsman, Mr. van Skalkbeck, went onto a television show to talk about credit bureau information, or let's call it blacklisting, or whatever is the topic of the day, the next day the phones don't stop ringing, and then people, they relate. They say, well, I heard that story and I've had a similar issue. And then, of course, it will die down again, and then we have to do something new. In order to get into the media, you have to write press releases. The only way to do that is you have to look at the issues, the topical issues that consumers relate to, because they must read it and they say, oh, you know what, I've had a similar problem, or my mother or my sister or somebody that I know, they also had this issue. They couldn't get credit because of this. They were blacklisted. They couldn't get a response from a credit provider. They didn't get statements, etc., etc. Community workshops. In South Africa, there are lots of community workshops arranged by various government departments. We go to them, we ask them for 1 hour out of the whole day, because they often have a full day workshops, where we just stand up and we tell the community who we are and what we do, so that if they have a problem in the future, they can contact us. We also, beginning of this year, we started with a new consumer education strategy. Now, this is slightly different from consumer awareness. This is where we go to a credit provider that we target that have lots of staff members, maybe 500, but even as little maybe as 100 staff members, or some credit providers have 1,000 staff members. We found that even if they work for a credit organization, those people, those staff members, do not necessarily know themselves how credit work. They do not know how credit bureau information work. They do not. None of them have ever obtained their own credit reports, and they work for a credit provider. So we target smaller groups. We do half a day training with them, and this is personal financial education, where we tell them how to budget, how to draw their own credit reports, how to read it, and how to resolve issues. The consumers love it. They really feel as if they've heard news that nobody has ever shared with them before, we've had a great response. But as you've seen here from this slide, that it's not all positive. It's difficult to get in because the credit providers will say no, they can't let their staff off for half a day. It's difficult. Why they're already doing their own training. It's not necessary for us to come in. But what I can say is that where we have done this education, financial education, we've really, I think, changed lives. We've seen emails afterwards where people say that we've changed their lives. And that is the idea that not only that we tell them about our office, because it's not just about us, but that they then get a better education about financial matters and credit bureau matters, and they will tell their family and their friends. And that's so we're going to try and spread the word. Just if it's of interest to you, the statistics for last year, look at the figure of the disputes received by the credit bureaus, 122,000 disputes. They have to record it and they have to report it to the regulators, so that is where we receive those figures. Of that, we only received 2,265 disputes about credit bureau matters. And that is perfectly in line with what we would expect, because a lot of the disputes are easily resolved by the credit bureaus, where a consumer will say, well, this account is listed twice, or that's not me, or yes, I've closed this account, here's the letter. There are a lot of disputes that really can be resolved quickly and easily by the credit bureaus, and we will only see the disputes where it's a difficult issue or where the consumer refuses to accept their outcome. In the non-bank credit department, a little bit more disputes, about 1,000 more. We average days to close that we're quite proud of is 47.7 days. I think it's also one of our things that we're very happy to report is that the amount that we saved for consumers was at least 3.8 million rand. Now, that is made up of small amounts of 1,000 rand, 2,000, 5,000 rand, where we managed to look at accounts and asked credit providers to recalculate where there was overpayment, where there was an overcharge to a consumer. And those recalculations or repayments to consumers, we add up and we got to 3.8 million just for last year. I've only got 3 case studies and very short because I wasn't going to bore you with long stories, but non-bank credit, here are 2 typical cases. The one is a consumer comes to us and the typical complaint would be is I've been paying for a very long time and they say that I still owe another couple of 100,000. How is this possible? Consumers do not know how to calculate interest themselves. They do not understand how the balances were calculated. And then they don't receive any real assistance from the credit providers except that this is the amount owing and this is what you have to pay because we say so. In terms of the National Credit Act, you cannot accelerate outstanding balance. Sorry, that means that at the time of default, you cannot just double up the amount. And in the past, that is actually what happened. If you owed 50,000 rand and you default on the 50,000 rand, they immediately doubled it to 100,000. Of course, that's totally illegal, and we would find something like that, and that is how this one consumer saved 200,000. The other case was where there's an emolument attachment order. Now, again, in our world, in the credit market, a lot of credit agreements, the consumers stop payment. Immediately, the credit provider will go to court, obtain a court order to get the monthly payment from the consumer's salary. That is an emolument attachment order in our law. So, after 2-3 months of breach and failure to pay a credit agreement, the money will start being deducted from the consumer's salary. That whole system has as a whole, sort of big set of problems. But in this case, the consumer again said, well, I've been paying this, and yes, I did owe the debt, and I've been paying it now, but I've been paying for a very long time, and I'm sure that I've overpaid. And then when we look at it, the credit provider just never stops this emolument detachment order. They never say to the consumer, okay, now you've paid the debt, you can stop now. They just keep on collecting it. And as long as that order is in place, the employer will keep on paying over every month because they don't have a balance, they don't know how much it is, they just know that they have a court order to pay over every month, and that's what they will do. So a lot of issues about that method of collection. In the credit information world, where this consumer specifically said that he did not receive notification of his default. And if he did, if he was notified before he was listed negatively, he would have rectified it. And then we will investigate. We will say, well, show us the letter. Where did you inform the consumer? Show us proof of postage. That was not, the process wasn't followed correctly. And then, of course, they have to remove that negative listing from the consumer's credit profile, and they have to start the process afresh. But hopefully, in a case like this, the consumer can now rectify the default if it was a case that he just wasn't aware of it, and then he will never be listed negatively on the credit bureaus. These values, the last few slides, I've just stated here what, in our view, the Credit Ombud of South Africa, what we think is the value of an Ombud scheme. And I think the most important one here is this value is the same for consumers and business as well as for our general credit market. That if the consumers have confidence in the financial markets, they will do business. And one of the key factors to increase consumer confidence is to make sure that there's an accessible and user-friendly arrangement to resolve their disputes. They don't need to go to an expensive lawyer. They don't need to go to litigation, because we all understand that these days that's just not viable. For most consumers, they cannot do that. So if they know, if they know in the back of their minds that if something goes wrong with this agreement, at least I can go to the Credit Ombud, then they're more likely to enter into the agreement with confidence. And the same principle applies to the credit bureaus, that if they think that I'm being listed, but if there's anything wrong with that listing, there's a place where I can go and complain, and they will sort it out fairly. That gives them a lot of confidence. So that is what I'm saying there. That's the confidence that we give to consumers, that it will be resolved quickly, easily, informally, without them seeing a lawyer, which most consumers in South Africa just cannot afford. But on the other hand, business will also benefit, because consumers, if they know that the disputes are going to be resolved with no cost to them, and that there's somebody else independently who will look at it fairly and who will also assist them if there's anything wrong, then there's a value to the benefit to the business. The other thing, of course, is that we feel that we restore the relationship between consumers and business. If they were negative about the business, if they were complaining, criticizing business, and that goes for the credit bureaus as well, if they have their disputes resolved fairly, they're less likely to carry on criticizing and complaining, and they're more likely to carry on doing business. So we think that's a real value to business. But then similarly to the whole industry, because we assist the courts with their workload, and if we satisfy both parties, the customer and the business, their expectations, then they can carry on with their business relationship, and that consumer will maybe go back to the same organization again. The one that he was so cross with just the other day, he will go back and he will buy some more or borrow some more money. And we can also see issues, if there are any systemic issues, and we can raise it with an industry, we can raise it with an organization. If we see too many complaints from consumers of a certain organization, we can advise them, and that is of course very important to them, and they see the value in that. Then finally, I was asked to just touch on challenges and recommendations. Well, I think from our perspective, constant communication with stakeholders to enforce the value proposition of the Ombuds Office is very important. As I've said earlier, there's institutional memory that is lost when there's new positions filled and change of staff, people retire, and the new people do not always know why we were created. They do not see the value. They just see maybe the invoice that they've received, and they do not see the value that their predecessors have seen. Financial challenges, we've got our fair share of financial challenges because this office is sometimes seen by the industry as a nice to have, but not a necessity. So if times are tough, we're one of the first accounts that they start querying. The other expenses that they have to pay. But the Credit Ombuds Office, they will think, do we still want to belong to the Ombuds Office? How many complaints did we receive? Were they doing a good job? So that's always an issue. Misunderstandings can lead to a lack of trust, and that is, when our case managers get bogged down into dealing with disputes and writing to their counterparts in the credit bureaus and in the credit organizations. Between them, there can be a misunderstanding. The one can feel the other one is, sort of taking the wrong stance, misinterpreting the law, and that can lead to a lack of trust, and also a feeling of, we don't like this, we don't want to listen. But if you just understand that could happen, and you just escalate it and go to management. Normally, management of an organization can understand why the Ombuds Office is necessary, and maybe case managers can't always see the point. It's a constant challenge for us to remain seen to be unbiased and independent. I don't think it's difficult for us to be unbiased and independent, but people think that if we write an article about something that goes wrong in credit bureaus and credit information, that we're suddenly biased against the credit bureaus. And that is, for example, not the case at all. We're just trying to educate consumers what to look out for. But that doesn't mean that we, in future, will treat an individual case in an unbiased manner. Recommendations, well, we have to recommend that there's a constant analysis of the feedback from the consumer complaints. If you don't see consumer complaints, if it's not collated in one place, like our office, you won't know what it's all about. You won't see trends. There won't be improvements in your own business that you can, sort of learn from the complaints. And you also, both the Ombuds Office, as well as our counterparts in the industry, the credit bureaus and the credit providers, we have to constantly review our processes to remain relevant, because business changes, consumers change, legislation changes. But it doesn't mean that there's no longer a place for us. There will always be a place for ADR, which is alternative dispute resolution, alternative to the courts, free of charge to the consumers, but at the same time providing a service to the industry. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. That was very interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Rihanna? You're allowed to take your microphones off mute now, guys. Well, I'll kick off with a question if that's okay, Rihanna. I just wondered at the beginning you mentioned that the opinion of consumers and even government of credit bureaus wasn't particularly a positive one. Do you actually think this has changed since 2004 when you set up? Maybe in South Africa, do you think it's more positive now?
I'm going to say yes and no. I think amongst the consumers, a few educated consumers will understand that the credit bureau information is reflecting the truth, and it is accurate, and it is the way it is. So if you didn't pay your account, then that is what will reflect, and that if you've got a good credit record, that's positive for you, and you know, it's a good thing, and they're proud of the fact that they've got a good credit report. But I think that those consumers are by far in the minority. Most people still use this word that they are blacklisted, and they only deal with credit bureaus, credit reports, the minute they're refused for credit or even for a job. So I think amongst the consumer general population, it's still negative because of lack of understanding. Despite years of consumer education done by our office, by the regulator, and by the credit bureaus. From government side, it's split because you know, in the early part of this year, there were discussions in Parliament about changing our laws. And one of the sections that they wanted to change, you know, was around credit bureau information. And we heard some very negative comments coming out of, you know, parliamentary members about credit bureaus and how inaccurate the information is. And as I say, this will then in turn come from constituencies and consumers that they deal with, who then went and complained to them. So there were some very negative perceptions there, but I do think that if you talk about government as a whole, that they've realized the value of credit information and that they have tried to protect it to a large extent with the legislation. So it's not all negative. They understand that for business in South Africa, it is absolutely necessary to share information.
Thank you for that. I do have one more question. I was reading that Moody's downgraded the 4 biggest banks in South Africa back in August, and I just wondered if you were talking about hot topic issues. I wondered if you'd actually seen a rise in complaints since that happened. I'm thinking because the banks are very likely to have raised borrowing costs and also subjected consumers to more stringent credit checking. So have you seen a rise, or do you envisage a rise in complaints?
We haven't seen a rise in complaints, but I do think from the latest stats, if I remember correctly, that the credit bureaus have seen a rise in complaints. It is due to that, and the banks being more stringent. You know, I mean, that's difficult to say. It could just be that the consumers can simply not afford it, and they are being turned down because of affordability. And, you know, it depends on whether they will challenge it. So I have seen, you know, not at our office, because I think that our office will only see the complaints that are, let's call them real complaints, real difficult issues that the bureaus cannot resolve themselves. But there were a rise in complaints at the bureaus, and I'm not sure what the cause was, whether it was anything to do with the Moody's downgrading.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anyone else have any questions? I think everybody's being shy today, Rihanna.
Really? Well, I hope I'm not scary. Can I just offer, if anybody wants, you know, even afterwards, I mean, I'm sure my email address, you know, will be out there. If anybody wants to ask me any questions on email or any of the documents that I refer to, I will quite happily share it with them. And then some of it is, of course, on our website. There's also, as I say, annual reports, the press releases, where we do these little press releases in order to get into the news. Because if we don't get ourselves onto a television program or a radio program or in the newspapers, consumers don't know about us. But I'm quite happy to share any information afterwards on email or in writing.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time today, Rihanna. We really appreciate it. It's nice to see it from somebody else's point of view in the industry, and it kind of working with our marketing director. It's kind of given me some food for thought, how we should raise the profile of credit bureaus. So really appreciate that. So
yes, I mean, I think, sorry, just on a comment on that, I think a credit bureaus without a dispute mechanism is dangerous, unless you have a very sophisticated market that they really understand what it's all about. But if the consumers feel that they have nowhere to complain, you can get to the, sort of, it can lead to the same problems that we had a few years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we'll be posting the webinar on the website and through our social media. So I know there's a few people that have already emailed me that'll be checking back. So I'll pass on your details to them so they can contact you regarding the questions. So anyway, thank you very much, Rihanna. We'll be in touch.